I wanted to say thank you for being here. It's a very exciting day at South by Southwest. This is South by Southwest 2024, Day 3. Welcome to the visitors to Austin, and thank you all for being here. We have a very, very exciting panel today. I'm your humble moderator. My name is Bill Rice. I work with the St. David's Healthcare System, and we're going to introduce everybody in just a couple of minutes, but we're going to give a preview of the topic that I'll just do in the next 4 or 5 minutes with 4 or 5 slides. On the stage, though, we'll be excited to introduce, again, in a couple of minutes, 2 world-class neurosurgeons and the CEO of a company that's doing world-class work in something called connectomics. AI in the aging brain was the topic originally of this talk. We're calling a real-time audible because we want to speak more generally about AI in the brain. And we'll talk about aging as well. But there is a platform technology that's out, that's a very recently available platform technology, which changes the game in neurosurgery, psychiatry, and aging and dementia. And that's what we're here to talk about today, this game-changing platform technology. And you'll hear us talk about this word connectomics, kind of standing on the shoulders of the idea of genomics, connectomics. You know, structurally, forever, brains have been thought about as structures where there's centers. There's a motor cortex center, there's a visual center, there's a speech center, and that's kind of like having cities in Texas. And we know there's white matter, there's connections between them, but until a couple of years ago, the connections were kind of like that map where you have I-45 and I-35 and some, connections, right? But the real world of connections is in Texas is really this. And so it's a much more complicated network. And I think the theme of this conversation today is that this is all about the networks, the brain networks. And again, the technology you're going to be hearing about is a step change in our capability to see networks and understand networks and see them one at a time. So I'm halfway through my introduction. I'll be almost through here in a second. So the history of brain anatomy in 30 seconds on one slide is kind of this, that 100 years ago there was some ideas about locations, pathology-based. They would look at brain samples and do pathology slide looks at it. And we've had this evolution, and the Human Connectome Project was actually funded in 2010, I believe. There's something called the Human Connectome Project, and you're welcome to look that up, take pictures of this and remember it. But it now notices that there's 360 locations in the brain. They call them parcellations, like parcels of land. The cortex of the brain is the surface of the brain. You can imagine lots of parcels. And so in this image, the left image is the Human Connectome parcellations that we now recognize it's kind of the geography of the brain at the cortex, at the surface level. Parcellations, parcels of land is the analogy. And the left image, I guess, as you look at it, the right image as you look at it, is the connectome. It's this myriad of connections. And that's all important. And again, I'm going to let the neurosurgeons and the experts speak in more detail, but this is the conversation we're having today. And the last introductory slide is basically this one, which tries to sort of represent that connectome picture. I'll go back one. That picture that's on your right, which is like all the connections of the whole brain together. What's new is that now we can use AI and look at them one at a time as groupings of important networks. Again, it's all about the network. The network in your brain, when I say 4, and your brain somewhere knows that I meant the number 4, or for you, or on the golf course, 4. That's an instant thing that goes on by some network, and that's probably the network that connects to San Angelo, right, or whatever in our map. And so that's the introduction. The connectome is able to be seen, the networks of the brain. So here's a quick video, and then we'll do introductions.
Connectomics is the science of really understanding all the millions and billions of connections in the brain. In a normal brain, it's complicated enough, but when you start adding in pathology, like tumors or dementia, neurodegeneration, it alters all the connections and makes it even harder to understand.
Scientists using incredible technology to map what's going on inside the brain. Very welcome news for those who are struggling.
You have an advanced technology that is well and beyond what else is out there. that gives you potential for better patient outcomes and better patient engagement.
We can, with much more confidence, resect these tumors much more thoroughly, which translates into improved survival. And that's a huge deal.
So today we have the privilege of having on our lectern here three other folks that are deep experts. Two neurosurgeons you're going to meet in a second, and this Stephen Schuler, who's from the technology company that's producing these things. So we're very, very thankful for you and your being here. I can't say enough about the privilege it is to have the neurosurgeons. And so I thought maybe what we'd do is, rather than me introduce you, just let you go down and give a brief comment about how you found connectomics and how you got to neurosurgery, and in your case, the company. Just a brief introduction.
Yeah, hi Bill, thank you, and welcome everybody. This field of connectomics, I actually, my background is not neuroscience, and I'm not a neurosurgeon as my colleagues on the stage. My background was big tech. I worked in Silicon Valley. I worked at Facebook before it was Meta many years ago, and I loved my time there. But one of the things I was concerned about is that we were building really powerful technologies such as AI, and we were using them for useful things, but we weren't really using them to solve the biggest problems that were facing mankind or humankind. And I think one of those biggest problems is understanding the brain. When you look at things like neurodegeneration, mental illness, other brain diseases, I mean, there's over 2 billion people on Earth that suffer from those. 1 in 5 people in this room will have a diagnosable mental illness this year. And it's just gotten worse. There's no question that as many of the health outcomes in the world are improving because technology is improving, in the words of things like dementia, mental illness, brain disease, things are just getting worse. And why? The big reason why is we haven't had the tools to understand the brain that we have for so many other things. And so, as Bill mentioned at the outset, genomics has been around for many years and has really driven revolution in things like cancer and how we treat so many diseases today. Well, the brain is lagged behind. And so connectomics is really using AI to decode the brain, and it's a field that I came to about 6-7 years ago when I met some amazing neuroscientists, neurosurgeons, and some other data scientists. We got together and we started this company. And our goal is really to try to put a dent in the universe in a way that helps advance mankind. So that's how I came to this. And if you'll note my accent may be a little strange. I'm American, but I lived in Australia for many years. So we're an Australian-born company, but founded by people from around the world. So that's my background. Thanks.
Dr. Rodriguez?
Sure. Is it on? Okay, perfect. So I actually got into neurosurgery. I became interested as a child. I watched a lot of the Learning Channel before it was the home of 90 Day Fiance, back when you actually could learn things. And so I saw a video of this little girl who was about 2 years old with epilepsy, and they removed half of her brain. And then they showed her crawling around and acting like a normal toddler. And I was like, that's amazing. You can cut out large portions of the brain and the person can be normal. Now, that was in a child, a very young child who still has a lot of neuroplasticity. And fast forward over 20 years later, I'm now a brain tumor specialist. So I now understand, and I mainly treat adults. You can't cut out large portions of the brain and the person is normal. And I always tell people that I work on that my goal is for you to wake up the same or better. I don't want to damage your brain. That is the essence of who you are. That's how you interact with your family and friends. So now I use connectomics for that reason. So I found out about connectomics. There were some other, there's a lot of different softwares available, but to me this was the best software that's currently available to us in order to map out the brain and make sure that we can have people wake up from surgery safely.
And I'll just add, I'm looking at your background, Director of Neurological Surgery and Neurosurgical Oncology and Vice Chair of Research at University of Arkansas Medical Center. So thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you.
Dr. Jeevan.
So I'm Dhruve Jeevan, one of the adult and pediatric neurosurgeons here in Austin, Texas. I got into neurosciences and neurosurgery fairly early on through mentors, got interested in how the brain works, but throughout training, both as undergrad in neuroscience, it was it was fascinating to learn how little we understood of how the brain worked, and how little we were able to kind of interact with the brain and modify it. As undergrad, I was involved in stem cell research stuff and implanting stem cells for Parkinson's disease. Didn't have much impact. And as we've progressed, and with technology, I think things are starting to rapidly take off. And I think that's where AI has come in. The computing power behind AI is allowing us to analyze things better. We're understanding how individuals' brains function and how that individuality gives you your personality. And that's what's interesting about this. But it also allows us to analyze these pictures of your brains and understand how this is causing your disease state, and how we can then modify that disease state or modify these connections to improve your outcome. And that's what really got me into neuroscience, is how rapidly it's growing and how little we understand about it.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to show, I think, 3 slides that maybe Stephen can walk through and discuss, and then we'll kind of talk about the next question, which is, again, what is connectomics and how does it differ from other neuroimaging kind of modalities?
Yeah.
So just see what these are.
So just to simplify, and for those of you who are neuroscientists in the room, I apologize if I'm simplifying. But it's essentially AI to decode the brain. I often talk about our company as the open AI of the brain. So they're focusing on building large language models. We focus on building a large brain model. As complex as everything is on the internet that they're organizing in the latest, ChatGPT-4 is amazing. It's got about 1 trillion parameters. Well, your brain has about 60, 70 trillion. That's just between your ears. That's just one brain. So the mountain we have to climb is substantial. But luckily, in the past 5, 6 years, we've now got the computing power of the algorithms to start to make sense of it. So it's really just the dawn of this era where we're using AI now to understand the complexity of your brain as a data processor. Next slide, please. And just to build on Bill's analogy a little bit, you could think about us, or the technology of connectomics, as sort of building Google Maps for the brain. If you go back 10, 15 years, Google Maps was more basic. It showed you essentially a map of where you were going. But over the years, they've added much, much more layers of information and data richness to Google Maps now, so that you can not only just tell where you're going, you can tell how good the traffic is flowing and what the best route to go in, and you can choose different ways of getting there. And so that's sort of the way connectomics has evolved as well. Companies like us, we build 2 different components to our technology. The first is an atlas of your brain. That's essentially where the networks are located, where are the roads. So that's kind of the basic Google map. And then the second is a matrix of your brain, which really compares how different portions of your brain, we call them parcels, how they're speaking to other parts of your brain and whether they're talking normally. So essentially, things like mental illness, or just to simplify, are different parts of your brain talking too much or too little to other parts of your brain. Now, we can now map that, we can see it, we can visualize it in a way that was never possible before through this atlas and matrix technology. Next slide. And so this is what it looks like. Everyone has 7 major brain networks. There's many other subnetworks as well, but these are the major ones. And if you just look at the slide, there'll be names that you're familiar with if you don't have a neuroscience background. Things like your ability to see, or your ability to speak, your ability to move. But then there's other networks there that are newer, and in fact, they were new to neurosurgeons and neuroscience until recently, such as the central executive network and the default mode network. Now, those have been harder to find. It's only been recently that we've been able to map them, and they matter because they relate to all of your higher cognitive functions. So your ability to multitask, your ability to focus on me right now and block out everything else, your ability to regulate your emotions, your ability to have emotions. They all live within those other networks, and your intelligence lives within them as well. And we'll talk more about it in terms of neurosurgery, but understanding where those networks are and how they're functioning is the core to things like really understanding things like mental illness and neurodegeneration. And we haven't had these tools until recently with the dawn of connectomics. So I often talk about, when we write the history of this century, I think there'll be a chapter on connectomics, and I think that's how important this technology is.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask the neurosurgeons to comment in 1 second, but I want to make the point that this connectomic stuff, this magical mapping, this AI-based process is again, it's not data science like the large language model stuff, and it's not the same data science as other things, but it's the data science of imaging, but it's not reading the images. You've heard of data science that they read mammograms, they read, different things. This is, there is derivative data that comes from MRIs, and it turns out that probably every MRI that is near you at your home has the capability to send that data that creates the images that a doctor looks at, the radiologist looks at, the neurosurgeon looks at. They can take that same data and send it off to a technology company that can do very advanced data, AI, and translate that into these connectome maps. That's what's going on here. And I'll leave it at that because there's a very interesting and deeper technology discussion, which we'll save and we can talk about another time or through questions if you want. But I wanted you to know this is not like some rocket science that's available in one place. This is potentially available. Now again, anyway, this is coming from MRIs that you're getting already. So let's ask the neurosurgeons to, again, respond to make sure I'm true on that and tell us the truth. But, how did you come to connectomics, and what's different about connectomics versus other methodologies you've had in the past, to look at brain structure before you're doing a procedure?
Sure. So for me, I mentioned I'm a brain tumor specialist, and basically connectomics has allowed me to help people in regards to whether or not they A, qualify for surgery, or B, making sure that they wake up from surgery with their full function. So for example, before connectomics, I could look at a brain scan and in rudimentary terms tell you your language is going to be affected, your ability to move your right arm or your right leg is going to be affected. But now I'm looking at this a little bit differently. So the default mode network is something that we talked about. That actually gives you some information on autobiographical memory, for example. So if I were to operate in that area, and sometimes there's a tumor there, so I may need to think about this, you may wake up and not have any memory of your childhood or things that you did with your family. Now that's a really big deficit, but before I wouldn't be able to tell you that. I might have just operated there, and then you wake up and your family, like in the hospital, the person's talking to me, they're moving their arms and legs. It's a very rudimentary function. When you go home, your family's like, hey, let's talk about, remember that Thanksgiving 5 years ago and this private joke that we have, and remember what you did at that Thanksgiving dinner? You wouldn't remember that. So your interactions are going to be very, very different. And that is something that I think is really important. So now that I have that capability, I can tell people like, hey, maybe we need to alter your surgery plan. Maybe you need a biopsy. These things are going to be really important in your life and how you live them. Let's talk about weighing quality of life and quantity of life, because yes, for brain tumors, it's helpful to get it taken out as much as possible to remove the tumor, but at the same time, I don't want you to be at home and not remember a family recipe or be able to talk to your family and friends. So that's the capability we have now.
So part of my work is apart from the brain tumor stuff, I do a lot of functional neurosurgery. So the understanding around that is we want to understand how the brain functions. And I think that's where connectomics and this technology has become useful. Because, yes, we can go out and scan everyone's brain and say, okay, these are the connections you have, and this is how it's making you as an individual you. But when we take these scans, there's a lot of individuality to it. I look at hundreds of pediatric scans, kids who have epilepsy, who have cerebral palsy, who have developmental delays. Some of their MRIs look completely normal, right? But they have major deficits. They have the way they interact with the world can be altered. Autism and all this stuff is, their MRIs of their brains could look completely normal, but underlying their connections and this matrix that Stephen had brought up, and how that differs and how these connections are talking to each other, that's what fascinates me. Now I can take that information and go, okay, well, what can I do to change that? How can I change the way these connections are interacting? So we go back to that Google Map analogy. Okay, great, I know all the roads there, but I want to know, how do I get from point A to point B, not only just by the simplest route, can I go an alternative route? If there's a break in one route, can I go another way? Or even I'm saying, hey, there's a lot of traffic on this route, and with population increasing, the traffic's going to get worse. Do I need to build new connections to make sure that that route from A to B is still going to stay functional? And I think that's where this field is going. And AI is helping, because if I took everyone's MRI of their brain in this room, it would take me forever to analyze it, right? And then I've got to put in the data about your personality. I've got to give you all questionnaires about your personalities and figure out how your personality maps to that MRI. That's just too much data for me to analyze when I'm meeting a patient face-to-face for the first time. And that's where AI and this technology is really helping. It's allowing me to interact with the patient in the room and say, okay, this is how your brain functions, this is what I need to do to help you, and this is how you're going to end up afterwards.
Thank you. So I'm going to show 2 more slides to stimulate conversation, and then we'll come to the question, more details on how it's used in neurosurgery. And again, Stephen, do you want to just talk about this? This was the
yeah. I mean, I would also defer to the surgeons on the
Sure.
on the stage as well. But essentially, when it comes, we build a platform for brain analytics based on AI, a large brain platform, and over time we and others, partners, will build hundreds and hundreds of applications on top of here, both for the problems of the brain in the world of medicine, and also for the potential of the brain in things like learning and development, intelligence augmentation, human-machine interface. So this isn't just limited to neurosurgery and to medicine, it's much more broad than that. But the first applications we have been building have been for things like neurosurgery, and that's why we're strictly focused on that today. And this goes an example of just how different it works with our technology, and with connectomics. On the left-hand side, you have a standard MRI. MRI is a great technology, been around for 30, 40 years. You know, there's an MRI in every town. There's 50,000 MRIs on the face of the earth, and it's great, bog standard, reliable, safe technology. But it has its limitations, and one of the limitations is when you're looking at an MRI just as an image, particularly when it comes to things like mental illness or even for tumor surgery, it only tells you so much. As the doctors were saying, you know, when you have a tumor that you need to resect or take out, it's going to be wrapped around or close to very important brain networks. And those networks are all slightly different in everybody's brains and not in the exact same spot, particularly with the tumor, which tends to push those networks around. And so the challenge is, well, how do I, as a surgeon, how do you know where not to cut? Essentially, you're trying to minimize the damage you're going to do. Now, with the image on the left, it really tells you almost nothing about where not to cut, because if you've ever seen a neurosurgery performed, there's no signposts in the brain. It's like a mush, and in that mush is everything that makes you human. But on the right-hand side, that's what now we can enable through connectomics is now, no, here's exactly where the networks are that matter and where they're located, so that you can start to have those discussions about minimizing those deficits. So this is just another illustration.
This, I believe, is a slide we're going to listen to, and this is going to be a surgeon that's going to talk about it, and then I want to come back to you guys to comment on it, but here we go.
Key AI features is the ability to look at very complicated connection anatomy, such as a brain cancer like you see here, and to make sense of it. It's able to determine that networks have been transected, as you see here, by the tumor, that other networks are draped over the tumor, like you see here, and finally, that it can even figure out very complicated networks, like the salience network seen here, a critical pathway normally connected by a straight bundle. But in this case, the AI has figured out that the network has been splayed open, and this would be impossible for a human to determine.
You couldn't see it, but as it rotated around, the tumor that's there sort of pushed the, if I got it right,
the salience network, yeah.
Right. It pushed the, you know, the connectome of that important network to the side and all this, and it was in the middle of it all. And so all of a sudden, if he can see that, he or she, then you can resect that tumor differently, and you can save a lot of function you could never save. So I'm not a neurosurgeon, but would you please, Dr. Jeevan, you could start this time. when you watch that, what is that, you know, how do you translate that or help the audience understand what that is for you in your practice, and give us maybe an anonymized case example if you can get, if you can.
So, okay, so let me put this out there. If you came to me and we MRI'd your brain and we found a tumor that's sitting right in your speech area, or where we thought your speech was, right? How many of you would say, okay, go and cut it out because there's a tumor there, knowing that you may never be able to speak again? No one would put their hand up for that, right? I don't want to not be able to speak ever again. That's the wrong thing to do. And then you go, okay, well, I can't guarantee you that after we take this tumor out that you're never going to speak again, but if I do this surgery with you awake, I could potentially try and map out where your speech is. But you have to be awake for the surgery, right? So we're going to be cutting into your head, trying to take this tumor out, trying to find out where your speech is while you're awake in the operating room. And, you know, some people may have the personality or the capability to do that. You know, they'll stay nice and relaxed in the operating room, we can test it, and they'll understand that, hey, we may not be able to take all the tumor out because we find your speech is in the middle of this thing. Now, if I tell you, okay, we have this picture that tells us fairly reliably where your speech is. And it's been moved, actually, right? It's been moved away from where this tumor is. And now I can take this tumor out safely. I can tell you with confidence that I can take out 100% of it. We're not going to affect your speech because it's moved away, because that's what the map's telling me. And I don't need to do it awake anymore because it's reliable. I think everyone in the room would then say, take this out of my head now, right? No one's going to say no to that because I can give you confidence that this is accurate, and now we've mapped your brain precisely to your brain. It's not mapped to anyone else. This is exactly what your outcome's going to be. And I think a lot more people will put their hand up and volunteer for that than before.
Yes, I think that the speech is a very good example. I think that even when we do awake surgery and we map out speech, it's very rudimentary, and a lot of people can't tolerate. Typically, a brain surgery lasts about 4 hours on average. So being awake for 4 hours without being able to move your head, not everyone can tolerate that. But the type of speech that we're able to map out in surgery is very rudimentary. It's not, and then also for people who are bilingual or multilingual, we may not have the capability of mapping you out in your native language, or if you speak multiple languages. Arabic is an example of a language that maps to both hemispheres. So it's very rudimentary. But definitely now we have better tools in order to do surgery that is safer and actually much more comfortable for the person.
I want to ask the neurosurgeons a question. And Dr. Shagru, who's another expert in this field and is widely regarded, has said that when a patient comes to a neurosurgeon with a brain tumor, only about 80% are resectable because of the problem of having a tumor in a key area that you wouldn't want to sacrifice. And that's obviously a decision that every patient has to make or could make with the neurosurgeons. But what he said was that with connectomics, you can move that 80% of resectable cases to 90%, which is a very big improvement, 80% to 90% being resectable. Is that your experience, and you believe that would be, the way to think about this, as it opens up the idea of resectability of more patients who do want to have, brain surgery for cancer, things like this?
I think so, but not only that. The interesting thing that that Dr. Shuguru says is it's not only your ability to have a resection or a brain surgery, but it's also the after effect, right? So what connections or what pathways have we changed in your brain with this? And then can we modify other pathways to compensate for what you could potentially lose for surgery? So he shows this classic example. He gives it in all the talks he gives to the various neurosurgery departments, where we have a patient who has a tumor right in the area of what we term as your backup generator for your movement, your supplementary motor cortex. And we know that patient, if we take that tumor out, they're going to wake up with a significant weakness. You know, they're going to be paralyzed on one side to some degree. But we know that if you rehab or stimulate the primary motor cortex, or the backup generally fits in the primary motor cortex next to it, you can relearn or rehabilitate that patient to return their function. And that's the exciting part. Like, how do we go about then enhancing these other connections to compensate for what deficits we may be causing? And you know, he does it using transcranial magnetic stimulation, relatively non-invasive. You go into your physical therapist, they do this transcranial magnetic stimulation to the area that's mapped, so we know exactly which area to stimulate now. Improve the connections in the area while you're doing therapy, and therefore improve your weakness.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I should amplify it. So just to show the breadth of how connectomics can even work just in this one example. And tumor surgery in the realm of medicine is a relatively small field. It's a relatively small and very serious use case. But we've started there for a specific reason, and the reason is it's so obvious that our technology makes a massive difference. We think our technology will make a massive difference in things like mental illness and neurodegeneration and stroke and diseases of consciousness like coma. Over time, we're building those tools as well. But when you start here, what really matters is where those networks are located and trying to minimize those deficits. We've got some surgeons now that are going further. So they're starting to say, well, if they have the time, they'll do our scan, say, a month or so before the surgery. They'll identify where that tumor is located. They may see that there's some networks that could be affected by the resection. They'll then say, well, let's send this patient for some neurostimulation. You mentioned TMS. It's a magnetic coil, a non-invasive stimulation technique. They will then, because of neuroplasticity, the brain can be rewired quite easily. They will then essentially rewire that brain to move that network out of the way of the surgical path they want to choose to get to the tumor. They'll then perform the surgery, resect the tumor, and then go back to rehab afterwards to move that network back to where it should be. So literally kind of moving it out of the way and then moving it back. And so it's a whole different approach to how you think about neurosurgery. And then when it comes to rehab after that surgery, because even the best surgeries, even with our technology, some will have deficits and things that need to be, that will need to be repaired. Our technology is now being used for that rehab for things like, again, TMS, to be able to bring that patient's brain back to life, to re-stimulate, to repair those networks as quickly as possible. And so we've now got a lot of evidence that our technology works amazingly well when it comes to rehabbing damaged brains, either from surgery or for other types of brain damage as well.
Dr. Rodriguez, yeah.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to say is that to me the technology is iterative, so meaning it gets better the more you use it. And I think part of it is an AI platform, so the more data that we put into the system, the better it gets. But secondly, from a clinician's point of view, now I pretty much do it for almost everyone. And the reason is traditionally we have in our heads of brain maps, like rudimentary brain maps, which you showed earlier, the Brodmann's area. But a lot of things are rewired, and that personalized care for not everyone's motor area is where I think it would be based off of my neuroscience knowledge. And so using it for everyone, you actually start to realize, oh, I thought this person could not have surgery, but this part of the brain is mapping somewhere else, so I can do surgery. And the same is true the opposite way, that sometimes I think, oh, it's going to be totally fine to do this, and then I map out and I say, oh no, this is dangerous. I should not, do this surgery. So it helps both ways, but it is iterative. It gets better the more you use it.
Thank you. I want to jump to a subject that is of interest to Dr. Jeevan, I know, that would just be an additive to this, and then we're going to come right to the future, or actually neuropsychiatric disease and other uses besides just neurosurgical things. And I became aware of vagal nerve stimulation, not like what you're going to buy on Amazon, but vagal nerve stimulation can improve the upper function in a stroke of somebody who has upper limb injury. And you've got some interest in that, and I think some thoughts about how maybe the connectivity, the connectome would be, talk about that. I don't know how to say it exactly, but the connectomics might be part of that repair process that apparently does happen with upper limb strokes and vagal nerve stimulation.
Yeah, so, there is evidence of various techniques, vagal nerve stimulation is one of them, to help stroke patients in recovery of their motor deficit or their weakness post their chronic stroke. So, they've had a stroke, they're not able to use their arm anymore, it's significantly affected their quality of life. They can rehab it to some degree, but they still continue to have significant weakness. There is evidence out there that that doing various maneuvers like stimulation or transcranial magnetic stimulation or vagal nerve stimulation paired with therapy helps improve their function. Now, if we know, or we take that step backwards, we go, okay, well, why do some patients benefit from this? Well, they must be changing their connections in their brain. Now, we can image them and go, okay, these are the connections that you're changing to allow you to recover. We take that step back further and we go, okay, you've come in with a stroke. How much recovery can we expect? Right? We take your MRI after you've had a stroke and say, okay, these are the connections that were affected. These are the connections not affected. We know that if we enhance these connections, you will have recovery. Right? We can predict that, okay, this is how much your stroke's going to affect you in the future. And that comes to what I'm interested in, is how do we modify, now we understand all these connections, how do we modify these connections to improve function?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to do 2 more slides here, I think, to begin to walk us into a conversation briefly on the future, and we're going to get to questions soon. So let's see what we have.
Yeah, I'll speak. So some of this we've already covered. It's always important to say, what's the so what of technology. I think a lot of AI is being built today that doesn't solve useful problems, particularly in medicine. In our company, we talk about a laser that cuts butter. You don't need a laser to cut butter. A butter knife does the job. And there are some things in medicine where you don't need AI. And we definitely think with our platform and the AI we build, we're trying to make clinicians, researchers, doctors better at what they do. Not to replace them at all, but as you've seen here, make them better at what they do. Give them tools, give them insight, knowledge based on AI that they could never have before. And so that's really what connectomics does. It's about finding these networks. It's about identifying anomalies in them, and then building useful tools that can be used in the real world to solve a useful problem. And the big so what is that, as I said before, I think this is a foundational technology for the 21st century, just as things like genomics have been in medicine, just as things like the internet has been, and as the things like generative AI are going to be. But this is another area of AI that I think is going to be absolutely transformational. And because it not only opens up the ability to conquer things like mental illness or neurodegeneration in concert with other technologies, but also I think beyond that for the areas, as I mentioned before, like learning and development and intelligence augmentation. I mean, we can find where you're creative in your connectome. We can find your ability to think laterally, your ability to do math. These things all are signatures in your connectome. Your brain is very plastic. It can be edited and rewired. And so there's a whole other world there where we could build technologies based on connectomics to make all of us not just healthier brains, but make our brains better at what they do already. And again, I think that's, in terms of advancing humanity, I think that's one of the most important things that AI can do, and connectomics is what can do it.
Thank you. I'm going to keep going.
Yeah, and this I just comment that in the medical sphere, as we're talking about today, we are starting to build in our space off of the Atlas and the Matrix now, and these are FDA-cleared products, so this is cleared for clinical use in things like neurosurgery. But we're now building other products and other applications in other areas and moving through research into clinical practice for all kinds of indications as you see on the slide. So it's not limited to neurosurgery. So we have tools today that are being used for things like depression and other mental illnesses, and really starting to, I think it was mentioned before, the rudimentary nature of how we understand the brain when it comes to diagnosis or treatment treatment recommendations, or how do we measure treatment response, how do we target treatments. All those things benefit hugely from connectomics. So one of the things I do talk about is, it's exciting that we're developing new drugs and therapies, and we shouldn't stop doing that. But when it comes to, again, things like mental illness, we don't know how to diagnose people in the first place, and we don't know where to target the drugs that we're using already. So why don't we just build better maps and better tools so that we can diagnose better and we can target better? That to me is the much more fundamental thing we need to do, rather than just build new therapies that also won't work because they're poorly prescribed. So this, I think, is where the real promise of connectomics in the future takes us.
Thank you. I think that's my slide. I was going to speak a second. So I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't play a psychiatrist, and we're not really psychiatrists up here per se. But the work in connectomics and depression is interesting. What the literature says, and this is from a paper probably that's from this year, I don't have the reference there, but I'll give it to anybody that needs it. And the idea is that just like lung cancer in the, I'm going to say 1940s, people would say, you've got lung cancer. And then pathologists would say, oh no, you've got small cell lung cancer. And then they said, oh, you have this gene defect in your lung cancer. So we continuously have learned to subgroup the lung cancers of different types and whatnot, And in depression, I would say generally, and again, I think in general it's true that we say you have depression. And we haven't really dissected that beyond to make 2 or 3 levels deeper into the type of what you have, again, biologically per se anyway. So what I'm trying to show on this slide is that the connectomics studies actually see 4 different patterns of connectome variation among patients with depression. So there may be ways now to think about depression that are wholly different, that are structurally constructed versus symptomatically constructed, which is what we have now, I think. And that opens a whole new door to the idea of therapy, subgroup effectiveness, all this thing, versus what we have now, which is a medication-based approach, obviously, and other kinds of therapies. But this is really, for the first time, a structural basis for that, and that very well may be a foundational part of the physiology of depression. And so I'll pause there and invite anybody else to say anything about it, but this was an example we wanted to share that is a non-neurosurgical example, but nonetheless a brain example.
It's always a concept of the magic bullet, right? That's the thing that we want in medicine. We want the magic bullet that's going to be personalized to you, that's going to treat your illness, right? So if you have a tumor with this specific gene abnormality, we know this drug will cure you of your cancer. How do we do that with brain and neuropsychiatric disorders where it's not necessarily a genetic thing, it's a way your brain is connected? As Stephen said, there's trillions of connections in your brain, and each trillion in each individual is different. And this is where this technology, along with AI, helps, because we can't analyze that. We don't have the computing power to do that. Computers do. And I think that's where we're going. And so this is just one example. Okay, this depression isn't just one entity, it's 4 different types. Now we can take and say, this drug will help this type, and this drug will help this type. It's not just a pick one out of my pocket today based on which drug rep came to my office and try it today. We're going to be more individualized to you.
But I will say that there are current applications for neurosurgery and different forms of psychiatric disease. So it comes to mind, a lot of people hear about deep brain stimulation. The most common use is in Parkinson's disease, but there are other uses, like, for example, people with obsessive compulsive disorder can get a brain stimulator and have help for that. And then also there's new work with addiction of making lesions of the brain or stimulating the brain to help someone actually that has failed drug rehab programs multiple times. And maybe we can start to think about this at a wider level. And there has been some deep brain stimulation for people with depression in clinical trial. So this is not like futuristic in the sense of 30 years from now. This is probably within the next decade.
Thank you, thank you. So I wonder if anybody wants to talk about aging in the connectomic realm, and then if we have that brief conversation, then we want to open up for questions. It's about 15 minutes left, and I want to be respectful of the time and that we have allotted. Aging in connectomics, dementia, How do we think about that?
It's, I don't know, in your practice, but certainly we have patients who come I come into my office and say, hey, you've taken a picture of my brain. Do I have dementia? Like, I mean, it's very hard to explain to them that, hold on, it's not just a picture thing, right? It's not just, I can't take a one-off picture and say you have dementia. That's analysis. And dementia is such a big, overarching diagnosis. There's frontotemporal dementia, there's Alzheimer's, there's all these other neurodegenerative things that can contribute to dementia. And I think coming in and saying, oh, do I have dementia, is a very rudimentary thing, and it's trying to educate patients that, no, that's not the way we think anymore. We have better tools to understand how is your brain aging and what effects is it going to have cognitively down the line. Mm-hmm. And I think that's another application that will be explored, needs to be explored with this technology.
I would say that for me, obviously there are changes that happen to your brain naturally as you age, in regards to memory and other things and similarly when you think about developing, as you develop from a child into adult, there are obviously large changes that occur. I think we're just starting to understand these changes. Something that there was recently a paper in Nature Neuroscience about how the brain has neuroplasticity during pregnancy and the peripartum period. And that was fascinating to see how the brain changes during that period of time. So you would start to think about, well, what happens during menopause? I'm definitely thinking about that in the years to come. How is my brain going to change? How are these natural parts of aging, how is it going to affect my brain? And there's very minimal research for us to understand that. I hope that we will start to integrate connectomics because obviously as people age, our brains don't work necessarily at the same level that they did, and maybe we can start thinking about ways we can augment that function.
I'll make one point on that, and again, I've deferred always to the experts, but with Dr. Shagru asking this question, he made the point that your cortical structures in the brain tend to decline in volume or get smaller over time, and an MRI of somebody with dementia can look the same with somebody that has not dementia, but each having this getting smallness of the cortex being part of the character of the MRI. But what he said is two things. One is if there's asymmetry, maybe that's a signal, but also his inference was that just because the cortex is getting smaller in people that don't have dementia and that do, that may signify that we have yet to get there, but the study of connections and connectomics will actually march us into a better understanding of what dementia is as it relates to that part of the physiology, knowing that the cortex alone is not the story because you've got the normals that compare with the dementia, Questions, please.
I appreciate you moving the conversation into aging and cognitive decline. I'm a neurology patient and patient advocate working in the Parkinson's space, and most notably with organizations like the Michael J. Fox Foundation, where they're doing huge decade-long studies, MRIs of people over time. We've got this huge bank of information. It seems like putting this next generation AI connection to that to try to piece out what's going on, because it's tied to all biomarkers and all. How close are we to really applying this in neurodegeneration and in clinical trials and things like that to get meaning out of these images?
So we've got trials going on now. We're not as close as we are. So for example, with what you saw with neurosurgery, that's an advanced technology application that we've got FDA clearance. It's being used, it's clinical practice now in around the world. But we're further behind. We're not as far advanced in terms of what we're doing with neurodegeneration and dementia. It's funny you should mention that Michael J. Fox. One of the challenges we have is access to the right data to build the tools that we need, and so we've probably built the world's largest repository of phenotypic brain scan data, machine learning grade brain data we have in our kind of our data bank, but we always need more. So one of the relationships we'd like to build is with and Michael J. Fox Foundation's a great example of focusing on on a problem and really cracking it. I should chat to you afterwards because we might be able to connect. But it's not, just in short, no, we're early days in that space now, so I don't have a lot of new stuff to report. But we're confident that we'll be able to bring, in the hands of the right researchers, our, connectomics is going to start making a huge difference in that space.
I think your question is valid and correct. It comes back to the AI thing. AI only gets smarter with more data you feed it. So all this scans that you've accomplished, you put into this AI data bank, it now will give you connections specific to Parkinson's disease. You have to remember how Parkinson's disease is diagnosed. It's not a scan, it's a clinical diagnosis. You go see a neurologist and they say, oh, you have Parkinson's disease. Now you could go see another neurologist and that neurologist could say, you don't have Parkinson's disease. Right? There's one scan called the DAT scan, but it's not 100% reliable in diagnosing you with Parkinson's disease. And Parkinson's disease is just one title. There may be, like depression, different types of Parkinson's disease. If we take all your data and put it into an AI machine and say, you may learn that this is Parkinson's disease. This is what your brain scan should look like if you truly have Parkinson's disease. And you will now respond to therapy versus not. But it's true. The more data you feed it, the more it learns.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. Great session. I'm Alison Sklar. I'm from the other UT, the University of Toronto, as well as Baycrest and the Center for Aging and Brain Health Innovation. We actually have a session here tomorrow at 10 a.m. in the same room. Similar topic, talking about precision medicine linking in with aging and brain health. But thinking about colliding technologies. And to your point, Dr. Jeevan, you're talking about sometimes you see brain scans and there can be an issue, but you don't see it on the MRI. And the connections aren't just spatial, they're temporal too. So I guess one of the things that we will be talking about, because we're interested not just in these sorts of, the role of connectomics for therapeutics and treatment and diagnostics, but also for prevention and care for people in long-term care. You can't give everyone a 3T MRI, and there are portable MRI systems coming, but we're also very interested in like EEG, electroencephalography, because that can give us information about the timing. And I'm just wondering to what extent do you think that this approach can be used not just for diagnostics and therapeutics, but also for prevention and care if we can bring in these other kinds of technologies in collision, including EEG and the timing.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's all technologies build on each other, and ours is just one that's going to build with and around other technologies. And EEG is another modality of acquisition of brain data. We've looked at EEG. The extraction of EEG is it's cheaper than MRI. It's much more available. You can do it, at home. It's safe. It's safer. You don't need you don't need a physicist on staff when you do an EEG. But the challenges with EEG from a data science point of view is it doesn't get it doesn't get the deep brain structure connectivity that we need to build these sorts of maps. So it's not that it's not powerful enough.
So adding in so we're thinking of like in the virtual brain, it has the functional connectivity.
That's right.
MRI,
yeah.
As well as EEG, the timing.
So we see over time, MRI is the good news in MRI land is that MRIs are now becoming smaller, cheaper, head-only MRIs. They're developing technologies that are removing the lead shielding and the liquid nitrogen. There's a lot of MRIs are very expensive and cumbersome things to build and run, but now they're getting smaller and cheaper and lighter. So that works for us really well. But at the same time, we want to work with other modalities. And you could see EEG, for example, it might be that you get an MRI once a year using and mapping it with our technology for connectomics. But there's dipsticks along the way that could be EEG based because that's much more accessible. And there's other things like infrared technologies that are being developed too. So I think we're in an exciting time for imaging and for neurostimulation technologies today. But our technology